Hi everyone, the Partial Prophet here. Thanks for tuning in. So I wanted to remind you that we know in part and we prophesy in part. So in this video, I wanted to talk about the real 70th week. I did some study, and so I have some new ideas about the 70th week. So we'll take a look at that. And speaking of the fact that we prophesy in part, I wanted to talk about why it's hard to look at prophetic dates in the Bible and know what's going to happen in the future because of these dates. And I'll explain to you why. This is some of my thinking about this. So some of the issues with calculations or looking at these dates is one question that I have when I'm looking at dates in the Bible is God using the Gregorian calendar or the Hebrew calendar or both? Okay, so now obviously the Bible was written in Hebrew, but we know that the Bible is a book of prophecy, and I have a belief that that we are in the time of the Gentiles, and so God has been using the Christian church up to this time, and but also that God's people are also the Jewish people. I believe that both sets of people are his people, and so when he uses prophetic dates, I think it's possible that he could sometimes use the Gregorian calendar for prophecy to be fulfilled. Because I believe right now, especially in these end times, at the end of the Gentile age, he's speaking to both the Jewish people and the Christians. And so I believe that we'll see some things happen on the Gregorian calendar. But so let's look at Daniel 10:4-5. Okay, so in Daniel 10, he talks about on the 24th day of the first month, while I was by the bank of the great river, that is the Tigris, I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, there was a certain man dressed in linen. Okay, so a question you could ask yourself is, is this January 24th on the Gregorian calendar, or is this Nisan 24th on the Hebrew calendar? And then I wanted to bring in a third option, so those are possible days for the fulfillment of, like this prophecy. But another option could be like, it could almost be almost any month, because what if God restarts the calendar when Jesus returns? And then he makes that month that Jesus comes back the new first month. And so that's definitely something to think about. And then another thing I've been thinking a lot about is the dates in the Bible an actual date, or are they something symbolic? And then are time frames an actual time frame, or are they symbolic? So an example of that is in Revelation 12:6, we see the woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. Okay, and so what I've been thinking about a lot lately is that these dates, the 1260 days, could actually be symbolic of the days of the time of the 666. Now, I don't believe the 666 connects to the Antichrist. I believe it connects to the third beast of Revelation. And so 1260 days. So what's kind of interesting is you have in that verse, it's actually Revelation 12:6. So you already see kind of a repeat of that 12 and that 6. And what's interesting too is that Donald Trump made his declaration about moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem on December 6th. And so definitely see a lot of connections there that make this more of a symbolic thing. Okay, and so then another thing to think about with prophetic dates in the Bible is, has this prophecy already been fulfilled, or is it something still to come? That's, really hard to tell sometimes. And then also, when do you start counting? So back to these verses in Daniel. So Daniel says, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia. Okay, so this is actually Gabriel talking. He says, the prince of the kingdom of Persia was withstanding me for 21 days. Then behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I've been left there with the kings of Persia. Okay, so we see a time frame in here, 21 days. And so um and that connects to, because Daniel actually fasts for 3 weeks. And so that 21 days, that 3 week time frame, is repeated in this chapter in Daniel. And so we have this time frame in 21 days. And so I figured out that I have this major issue that I'm always going to try to make the time frame shorter because I am impatient for Jesus to return. So that's an issue I have. I think other people have that issue too. And so we have to be careful. I mean, so with the 21 days, the point that I wanted to make is, sometimes we'll pick a date and say, oh, maybe that's when the 21st day start, the start of the 21 days, and then look for something to happen 21 days after that. And I actually have an example of me doing that coming up. But the thing is sometimes in scripture, we're not clear when 21 days started, so, so that's a problem. And then another problem that I realized too is that, here, let me read this. Has God blinded our eyes to the truth for some higher purpose we do not understand yet? Okay, so we see this concept in scripture in 2 Kings 4:27. This woman came to the man of God, Elisha, to the hill, and she caught hold of his feet. And Gehazi came near to push her away, but the man of God said, let her alone, for her soul is troubled within her, and the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me. So now, if you know about the prophet Elisha, he has a lot of, he was very powerful. He was able to do healings, and, he did a lot of great things, and, really had a lot of insight as a prophet. So it's kind of interesting that, even Elisha said, the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me. So what we see from this verse is that God is really in control of when we see things, even his prophets. So keep that in mind too. Okay, so I wanted to talk about the 70th week, and an issue that I had is, when do you start counting these 70 weeks? And so in my videos, if you've been watching my videos, you would know that I started counting the 70 weeks from when Trump made his announcement about moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem on December 6th, 2017. And so 70 weeks later was April 10th, 2019. And this was the day after the elections in Israel, when they announced that Netanyahu was the winner. But I think I made a mistake. I don't think that this was the 70th week that was discussed in Daniel. So here's the verse in Daniel where we get the 70th week, or 70 weeks. Okay, so that's from Daniel 9:24. And it says, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end to sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Okay, so when I look at this verse, I highlighted the part about bringing in everlasting righteousness. And so, one thing that I could be looking at this verse wrong is that I see it as kind of a messianic verse. I see it saying that we're going to see Jesus show up on the 70th week, because I believe he's the only one that could bring in everlasting righteousness. But it's interesting because there is a lot more in that verse that we see, this concept of to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin. So maybe the 70th week is the start of something, so that's something to think about too. And that, maybe something gets started on the 70th week, and then there's still a time frame to go before Jesus shows up. So something to think about. And then, so the context of this verse is that Daniel saw that 70 years had passed, and so he confessed and prayed. God sent Gabriel to explain to Daniel that there was still 70 more weeks to go. And so, that's been very interesting for us because all of us saw that it was not the 70th year of Israel being a nation as the date for the Lord's return, or other people are looking for the rapture. I don't believe in the rapture the way it's been traditionally taught. And that was May 14th, 2018. And so we see Gabriel came to Daniel and said, well, it's not 70 years. You still got to wait 70 more weeks. And so I think that's what we're experiencing, is that obviously it wasn't, at the 70th year anniversary of Israel, that there was still 70 more weeks to go. Let's see. Okay, so one thing I did then was I calculated 70 weeks after May 14th, 2018, to kind of go along with what I just said about, what Gabriel said to Daniel. And so here's what I found. September 16, 2019 was 70 years plus 70 weeks of Israel, or 490 days after 5/14/2019. But May 14, 2019 was on a Tuesday this year. So, okay, wait. The 490 days, oops, I have a typo, is 490 days after 5/14/2018, the 70th anniversary. And then, but May 14th, 2019 of this year was on a Tuesday. So you could have the 52nd week being on this Tuesday. And then if you add 18 more weeks to this date, you land on September 17th, 2019. So 70 years, 70 weeks could either be on that Monday, the 16th, or on the 17th. And so what I thought was really interesting is that we have a chiastic structure connected to 9/11 with September 17th of this year. Okay, so 9/11 on the Hebrew calendar is Elul 23, which was 9/23. Okay, so if you take 9/11, which is the Gregorian date, and you add 6 days, you get 9/17. And then if you take 9/17 and you add 6 days, you get 9/23. So it's like you have 9/17 in the middle with 5 days on each side, and then the 6th day on one side would be 9/23, and the 6th day on the other side would be 9/11. So see how that works out? Kind of interesting, huh? So I definitely think God's trying to say something about 9/11. And what's really interesting too is that on September 17th was the second set of elections in Israel. Okay, and so I'm assuming I covered that in here. Yes, I do. Okay, so it's interesting because if you look at the phrase "to make an end of sin," I thought that was kind of interesting because on September 10th of this year, we had, it was kind of an interesting day because that was the day that Netanyahu said he would annex 1/3 of the West Bank if he got elected. So the election in Israel was on September 17th, and so he was still campaigning. And he said, if you elect me, I'm going to annex 1/3 of the West Bank. Okay, now this is not the first time he said this. He actually first said that on April 6th, 2019. And that was right before, that was before the first set of elections in Israel this year. And what's interesting was that was said on April 6th, 2019. And so I highlighted the 6th because I wanted you to understand that what I'm seeing in this is that I see Trump kind of repeating a pattern. I mean, not Trump. I see Netanyahu repeating a pattern of Trump. And so what we had was President Trump earlier this year. He talked about recognizing the Golan Heights, as, like as Israeli territory. Um, and, so, I mean, it was kind of interesting because um, it just wasn't good behavior what Trump did with the Golan Heights. Um, and it was just kind of interesting that all of a sudden we see now Netanyahu like repeating that behavior. Um, and, it's kind of like they're just declaring to the world that this is what's going to happen. And, um, I mean, it's breaking laws to do that. Really, you only gain territory through war. And it's making Israel's enemies mad. It's just not good behavior. And so I think that Trump has done three things that has has made life dangerous for the people in Israel. And one of them was, moving the embassy to Jerusalem. The second one was the Golan Heights announcement. And then now the third one is his um, removing the troops out of Syria. Um, I was thinking the third, so I think those are the 3666s. Because what I believe is that it says six is the number of man. And so I think what happens is if you do something, and so Israel, the Jewish people are the man, and the church is the bride, the woman. And so if you do something to make life dangerous for the Jewish people, you get branded with this number six because you made life dangerous for the Jewish people. And so what we see is that, and so, I mean, I thought it was going to be the peace treaty, but things haven't, the Trump's deal of the century, I thought that was going to be his third six. And I mean, he did have that financial conference, and so that could be a third six, and then you could say moving the troops out of Syria would be the fourth sixth. Um, you know, but what's interesting to me is that Netanyahu talked about annexing the West Bank on April 6th. So I think that's where he gets the six. And then it's interesting. So this would be the second time that he said this when he's running for election. And then it's interesting that rockets were shot. I mean, they weren't shot specifically at Netanyahu, but they were shot in the area around the area that he was at. And then, they had to whisk him away, and then, they had to make sure he was safe before he could finish his campaign speech. So definitely a very interesting day. And then on September 11th, we see that was 18 years after 9/11 on the Gregorian calendar. And then in September 16th was this is the day that I was telling you about, that's 70 years and 70 weeks of Israel, 490 days from 5/14/2018. Okay, I put it right there. Hopefully that makes it clearer to you. And then what's interesting on this day, on September 16th, was that was the day, this is just fascinating, that Trump says, he tweets, America is locked and loaded, basically meaning we're ready to go to war with Iran. But then later that same day, he says he doesn't want a war with Iran. Very fascinating day. And then the next day is September 17th, which is 18 weeks after May 14th. Like I said, that could be 70 years plus 70 weeks. And what's interesting, it was the second set of elections connected to the 70th week. So on April 9th, April 9th was the actual elections, and April 10th was the day they announced that Netanyahu was the winner, even though he never was able to form a government, so he didn't really win. And so that happened 70 weeks after Trump made his announcement about moving the embassy to Jerusalem. And so I covered that in one of my previous videos. And then, so it's interesting that we see another 70 weeks connected to this date, September 17th. And then what's interesting too is that was the date that World War II started 80 years ago. So definitely very interesting. And then what's interesting too is 717. In Genesis 8:4, we see that was the date that the ark rested. And so what's interesting is Septem in the Roman 7, so the month of September used to be the 7th month. I think they added some other month somewhere. And so it could really technically be 717. And so it's kind of interesting when you talk about like the ark resting, we see kind of this picture of, Netanyahu, this election. I mean, he's still resting. He's still not the prime minister. I mean, he probably wouldn't say he's resting, because, um, he's still really fighting to try to become prime minister. Um, but it's interesting when you think about the 70 weeks being connected to making an end of sin. What we could see is that God is frustrating, like Netanyahu's desire to be in power, which is also frustrating Trump's desire to, roll out this deal of the century. And, so what we could be seeing is that God is causing events to happen to make an end of sin. He is putting an end to Trump and Netanyahu's behavior. Okay, and then on September 20th, just kind of an interesting date, that was the 77th week of the Gaza mob, so they have been going on for a really long time. And then September 21st was the International Day of Peace. I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on that seemed really prophetical. So I actually was really thinking the Messiah was going to show up then. And I didn't want to throw out this information because it's still really important information, very prophetical. And so on September 23rd, like I said, was 18 years after 9/11 on the Hebrew calendar. So we see that connection to 18 in Luke 13:4. Jesus is talking about the 18 who, I guess died when when a tower fell on them. So very, very kind of interesting. Definitely a connection to 9/11. And then we see in Luke 13:11, in sort of in that same passage, Jesus talked. There's a woman who's been sick for 18 years that comes to Jesus, in need of healing. So definitely very interesting, very prophetical, because the woman could be a picture of the church or America. We've been, sick since 9/11. We're bent double, we can't straighten up. When we're in need of the Messiah. So definitely very interesting. And then what's interesting about September 23rd is that was 4 years after Obama and the Pope met. In Washington, it was Yom Kippur. Definitely kind of interesting. And we see the 4-year time frame. Other people have talked about this, where you have 3 years in this in this prophecy about the fig tree or parable. It says there was no fruit on the fig tree that was planted in the vineyard. Okay, so I wanted to point out that what we're seeing is we see a fig tree that's being planted in the wrong place. Because how many people plant fig trees in their vineyard? You plant vines in your vineyard. So I wanted to point that out. So we see this picture of a fig tree that's like in the wrong place. And then what I wanted to talk about was really what happens on the 4th year of this fig tree is that that fertilizer was put on this fig tree, or dung. And so I think it could be a picture of, kind of a prophecy of, in the 4th year, we're gonna see, like, the fig tree could maybe possibly be a picture of the Antichrist or Obama that was planted in the vineyard. He's in the wrong place. And then, like 3 years could almost be like the time that Trump was president. And so we didn't really see anything happening from Obama, which was fine with me. And then, but what we're going to see is that, dung is going to be put on the fig tree. So another possibility is the fig tree could be Trump, and that we didn't really see any fruit from Trump in 3 years, and so then the dung being put on the tree would be, the Antichrist is now going to come and bring his dung, his destruction. Okay, and so then also on September 23rd was when fall begins. So definitely an interesting date. And then on September 30th was Rosh Hashanah. And so we know about Rosh Hashanah. It's the Day of Trumpets. And in Jeremiah 6:17, Jeremiah talks about sending a watchman where he says, listen to the sound of the trumpet. And so I'm thinking, we might want to pay attention to what happens on September 30th, because maybe God is sending us an important message. And what's really interesting too is that before Rosh Hashanah, though, like, they actually blow the trumpet. They blow the shofar. The Jewish people blow the shofar like the whole month of Elul, but they will not blow it on the last day of Elul, which is Elul 29, because they want to separate the blowing of the shofar during the month of Elul from the blowing of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. So very interesting. So what I think is kind of interesting is that on Rosh Hashanah on September 30th this year, we heard Iran's trumpet call, and what they said is the top Iran general in Iran, he said destroying Israel is an achievable goal. Okay, so now I think we want to pay attention to that. And so what I see is that there could be this picture of, we have been hearing Iran for years, saying, they death to Israel, they want to kill Israel, and and making lots of boast all the time, because that's what evil dictators do, is they make a lot of boast. But because this boast happened on, well, this was the general, not, some of the other guys we've been hearing from, because this happened on Rosh Hashanah, I think we might want to pay attention to that. Jeremiah says, listen to the sound of the trumpet. So definitely interesting. And then, okay, so back to this Daniel verses. He says, I had been mourning for 3 entire weeks, and then on the 24th day of the first month, while I was by the bank of the great river, that is the Tigris, the prince of the king, okay, and then I skipped ahead. So then what happens on the 24th is he has an encounter with Gabriel the angel, and so it's like a messianic, he has a visit from a messianic figure. And then, Gabriel says, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia was withstanding me for 21 days. Then behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left there with the kings of Persia. So, what we see from these verses is we definitely see like a 21-day and a 24-day connection. And so I actually was looking at, okay, so when I was first looking at this, I saw that, okay, so what happened was, let's go through the dates. On August 22nd, we saw Iran tries to attack Israel with a drone strike. On August 23rd, there was a West Bank terror attack. On August 24th, Israel thwarts Iran's drone strike, and they killed 2 Hezbollah operatives in Syria. On August 24th, there was also Tropical Storm Dorian formed. And then on August 25th, Nasrallah of Hezbollah vows to retaliate. So I wrote 21 days later, but I don't know what that means. Let me look here really quick at my notes. Yeah, I'm not really sure what that means. Okay. So what I was thinking is that I was wondering if, I don't know why I started counting from August 24th. I thought that was like a significant date. Um, and, um, so then 21 days from August 24th was September 14th, 2019. And then, so what was interesting about that date was it was a full harvest moon. That was an interesting day because Trump tweeted about a possible mutual defense treaty with Israel. And so then early on, I was wondering if Trump was Michael, where it says, Michael came to help me, for I had been left there with the kings of Persia. Now, the kings of Persia, it's interesting. This verse talks about the prince of the kingdom of Persia and then the kings of Persia. And so Persia, we, think of Iran when we think of Persia. But I also think there might be a prophetic shadow where Persia, like, okay, you know how we call Trump Cyrus? So Cyrus is the king of Persia, and then we read it in Daniel about Darius the Mede. And so we see something with like the Medes and the Persians. And so I think they could have prophetical significance where the Medes could be the Jewish people and the Persians could be the Christians. But then also, and so when I see this verse 13, when it says the prince of the kingdom of Persia, that could possibly be Donald Trump. And then the kings of Persia could be actually the people in Iran. So that it's talking about two types of people. That's a possibility. So I was looking at, for some reason, then I was looking at the 24th day. I mean, it was interesting that something happened on September 14th. And then I was like, oh, maybe that was day 21. And so then on day 24, I was like, oh, is the Messiah going to show up? That was going to be September 17th. And no, the Messiah didn't show up. It was just the day of elections in Israel. So see, I have a sad face. But it is interesting that we see a 21-24 day kind of connection. So 21 days from August 24th, which was when Israel thwarted the Iran drone strike. Because I was trying to basically what I was trying to do was pick a day where, if Israel was going to have like 21 days where Iran was like giving them a hard time, could you like start counting, on the day that they, shot down this drone? Because really what kind of happened was Iran got really mad about that. And Israel got, a lot of flack for that. And so I thought maybe that was like the start of the 21 days. But that's not what happened. But I'm not going to totally throw it away because I do think it could just be a 21-24 day connection. I just don't think it's the 21-24 day connection that I'm looking for where Messiah returns. Okay. And then, but what's interesting too is we have this other 21-24 connection. I mean, I really think God repeats himself and that he uses a lot of the same pictures all over the place. And so I saw there is this 21-24 connection with Hurricane Dorian. Okay, so on August 21st, what's fascinating about August 21st is that was 2 years after the Great American Solar Eclipse. And it was also 66 days after Trump Heights. Remember Trump Heights? That's the city that Netanyahu dedicated to Trump in Israel. So fascinating. We were wondering about, what could this Great American Solar Eclipse mean? Interesting. And what's very fascinating is that on this day, that was when Trump called himself the chosen one as he defended his trade war with China. And then he also retweeted, say that 10 times fast, retweeted a tweet saying he is the greatest president. Okay, the tweet that he sent again was this guy who said that Trump was the greatest president for Jews and for Israel, and that the Jews love Trump like he's the king of Israel. And so obviously Trump saw that and loved it, and had to pass that on. Um, and so very interesting that that all happened on August 21st, because I think what we can be seeing is that Trump is getting pretty high and mighty. That he's getting really arrogant. And he's finding these things that you know, feed his arrogance. And he's just kind of getting out of control. And so what's interesting was, so that happened on August 21st, and then on August 24th, like I said, that was the day that Israel, shot down blocked the Iran drone strike. But what's really interesting is that was the day the tropical storm Dorian formed. Okay, and so the reason why I thought that was interesting is, let's talk about Hurricane Dorian. Okay, so like I look at these hurricanes and I kind of check out the meaning of their names. And so Hurricane Dorian, so the meaning of the name Dorian says a member of a Hellenic people speaking the Doric dialect of Greek, thought to have entered Greece from the north. They settled in, I don't know, I'm assuming that's a Greece city, and later colonized Sicily and southern Italy. Okay, so we see a connection to Greek people, Hellenic people. And then what was interesting to me for Hurricane Dorian was I really saw kind of this attitude of defiance about the hurricane. Like, when they were showing us the people boarding, boarding up their places, and the messages that they wrote on their boards in, this would be in Florida, because they thought that was going to come there, and and they were just like, bring it on, Dorian, and it was kind of interesting because I saw more of this attitude of defiance rather than humility, which is, what I would prefer, where we're, instead of saying, bring it on, Dorian, say, give us grace, God. And so that was interesting to me. And then, Hurricane Dorian was a category 5, after it turned into a cat 5 after Israel was being bombed by Lebanon. So that was, so that happened on, September 1st, was when it turned to a cat 5. And then it was interesting because that was the 80th year anniversary after the start of World War II. And then, anyways, like I said, then that's when it turned to, oh yeah, and then I wanted to mention, and that was when Lebanon, was striking Israel's army base, and then Israel struck back. So that happened on that date. And so I just thought it was kind of interesting that here Israel is getting bombed, and so then like this tropical storm or hurricane gets even worse. So I mean, people had talked about, like, they didn't really think that Dorian was like a picture of judgment. And I mean, after I saw that it got worse after this issue with Israel, then then I really think, I mean, one of the things that we want to look at is, so the Bahamas, that which is where Dorian did most of her damage, is where many people from America vacation. What was interesting too is that it's also where Columbus landed. And so like, so there is a connection with the Bahamas to like America. And then, like, we see, like, I'm from Colorado Springs, and we've seen, like, with our fires and stuff, that we see kind of like our like places to recreate our, we had the Flying W Ranch like burned up in one of the fires that we had in town. And then the Royal Gorge Bridge, they had a big fire that did a lot of damage there. And then we have like um, the cog railway that we take up to the mountain. It is damaged and they're not using it right now. And so I think God will you know cause damage to allow damage to occur um, in places of recreation, to kind of get our attention, to make life uncomfortable for us. And so the fact that Bahamas got hit, I don't know how much it affects the tourist trade, but that was my thinking. And then what's interesting to me is that the other message that I felt like we got from Hurricane Dorian was it's like, we had destruction kind of brewing on America's border waiting to strike. Okay, does that not remind you of Israel's dangers on their borders? They have all these people on their borders and they don't know when they're going to hit. And that's, kind of what we saw with Dorian. And so it makes you uncomfortable. And so I think God might have been wanting us to get a taste of what it's like for Israel, to have this danger, on your border, not knowing, what's going to happen. And then what's interesting is, so I see there's a connection to, I think there's a connection with the, the Greek connection to the Antichrist. So in Daniel 10:20, this is, Gabriel says, do you understand why I came to you? But I shall now return to fight against the prince of Persia. So I am going forth, and behold, the prince of Greece is about to come. And so I actually think the prince of Persia is Trump, and so, like Jesus shows up and he's, the first thing he's going to deal with is Trump, okay, because he's making things bad for Israel. And then he was telling Daniel that the prince of Greece is about to come, and so I think what we see is a shadow of this picture of the Antichrist is about to come. With the the prince of Greece is going to come. We're going to have Jesus show up, and he's going to deal with Trump, and then I think he kind of ducks out. Jesus ducks out and lets Obama kind of rise to power and lets Obama deal with Trump as a judgment on Trump. That's what I think is going to happen. So kind of interesting. So was God sending a message with Hurricane Dorian? I mean, I think God's sending messages all the time. I just think we don't know what he's saying sometimes. So kind of interesting that this happened, on, August 24th, after Trump was so arrogant on the 21st. And then I thought it was interesting that we had Hurricane Humberto, and that became hurricane strength on September 16th. And so what was interesting for me with that was, so this follows Dorian. And it was kind of interesting. We had like 6 hurricanes all kind of forming at the same time, 3 on each side. Just really interesting at that time. And so what's interesting about Hurricane Humberto was the 8th named storm. The 3rd hurricane, there was 70,000 people affected in Bermuda. It was a category 3 as it approached Bermuda. And so if you look at the meaning of Humberto, it's the Spanish equivalent of Humbert, which is a name of Frankish origins. It's derived from the Germanic elements Hun, meaning bear cub, warrior, and Bert, meaning bright, famous. So, what this name could mean is a bright warrior or a bright child. So definitely a picture of Jesus. Especially because we see 8 in there, which is, 8 and 3, both numbers connected to Jesus. We see that 70 number in there. So definitely interesting. Okay, so then let's see, what am I doing here? Okay. Oh, and this is what I was saying, that for a second there I thought maybe Trump was, um, Michael, one of these chief princes, that came to help, you know, Gabriel or Daniel or whatever. Um, and um, so what was interesting was that, like on the 21st day was September 14th, 2019. And so what was interesting on that day was that was when Trump sent his tweet where he said, okay, I had a call today with Prime Minister Netanyahu to discuss the possibility of moving forward with a mutual defense treaty between the United States and Israel that would further anchor the tremendous alliance, okay, between our two countries. I look forward to continuing those discussions after the Israeli elections when we meet at the United Nations later this month. And so that's why I said for a short amount of time, I thought maybe Trump was this Michael. But then things have happened. And so now I am thinking actually that this Michael is, the Messiah. And so actually the, the person that comes to help is the Messiah. Because it says I have been left there with the kings of Persia, and so I said the kings of Persia could, either be people in Iran, or it could be, like the kings of Persia could also be the rulers of America. And so I actually think, well, so now looking at this, I think the kings of Persia could be, some of the presidents in America. And so, we see Gabriel, kind of saying like, like if Gabriel is like a picture of the Jewish people, then he could be saying, I've been left there with the kings of Persia, and so because we see with Israel that, some of the presidents in America have made things difficult, especially Obama and especially Trump, and then maybe some of the earlier ones too. So that's why we need the Messiah to come, to help the people of Israel. Okay, and so let's see. Okay, so back to the 70th week. Other people have the 70th week be a time frame of 7 years. Okay, so like, we've heard a lot of talk about the 7 years of tribulation. Okay, and so I wanted to talk about in the Joseph story, he talks about 7 years of abundance in Egypt, and then there's 7 years of famine. Okay, so if we see the description of the 7 years of abundance, we got to emphasize that this is abundance in Egypt. Okay, that's important. Okay, and then we see that Joseph goes on in the story to divide the 7 years of famine into 2 years and 5 years. Okay, when his brothers go to see him, Joseph says there's been 2 years and there's still 5 years to come of famine. Okay, and so what I'm wondering is that this is what I propose, is that I think the 7 years of abundance in Egypt. So if you think of Egypt as being a nation that doesn't follow God, we could see that this time frame, 7 years of abundance in Egypt, could be the 7 years that Obama was president. I mean, he was president 8 years, but I think, maybe, the last 7 years was when he did the most damage or something. And then what that was followed by was 2 years of famine. And so that could be 2 years of Trump. I mean, now we're up to like 2 years and 9 months or 10 months or something like that of Trump. And then the 2 years of famine are followed by 5 years of famine. And I think that could be the time of Messiah. And so when it says 5 years of famine, it won't be famine for God's people. It would be famine for the people that God's, bringing judgment to. And, another possibility could be the 5 years of famine is a picture of the time when Netanyahu started, kind of following in Trump's footsteps, so that's a possibility. And then after his time frame, then we have the time of Messiah. That's a possibility too. I'm not sure. So Okay, so then let's see. And so I wanted to talk about the 70th week. We get this from Daniel. Um, and so we have the time frame of 70 years, and so we've already passed that. And then it says 70 weeks have been decreed for your people in your holy city. I already read that. And then it says in verse 25, so you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the Prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined, and he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Okay, so what I'm wondering is, this goes back to where I'm seeing time frames as like figurative, more maybe than just the actual time frame, like they represent something, like they're prophetical shadows. And so like the 7 weeks, I already talked about the 7 years of abundance in Egypt. And so I'm wondering if, so God is saying there's going to be 7 weeks, and that's going to be the 7 years of Obama. And then we're going to have 62 weeks. And so, we see that 6 in there. And so I'm wondering with the 62, even with the 62 weeks, it's like, okay, so we see like a week or the number 7 being like the time of completion. And so I'm wondering with 62 weeks is if what we're seeing is like the completion of Trump's time doing his 6s. And then we see kind of a completion of Netanyahu's time doing his 6s. That we see, 62 could be 2 times 2 people that are doing 666 type stuff. And then, and I don't know, maybe Netanyahu only does 1/6, and then, at that point, God's like, okay, that's enough. We're gonna put an end to all this. And so then that would connect to the 2 years of famine that we talked about on the previous screen. And then this 1 week, I think, could be connected to the time of Messiah. So that is what I'm wondering. And then, so kind of to repeat, like, some of the other things I see in the Bible, is we see in Revelation 11:2, it talks about 42 months, a time frame of 42 months, and it talks about that's a time frame where the holy city is being trampled. And then it's also a time frame where the beast of the sea has power. And so what I think is the beast of the sea is Hillary. I think the dragon is Obama. And so they're given 42 months to trample the holy city. And so I definitely saw with Hillary and Obama that they spent 42 months kind of making a mess of the world, and making the Middle East more dangerous for the Jewish people. So because they really allowed, like the Muslim Brotherhood to come in power, really just created a mess. ISIS grew during that time. And then I'm kind of even wondering if there's like a repeat of the 42 months. Then we had John Kerry that followed Hillary, where he worked on the Iran deal. And so maybe he had the 42 months kind of to make that mess of a thing. Okay. And then what we see following the 42 months is we see where it talks about the 2 witnesses, witness for 1260 days. So like I said, the 1260 represents the 666. 1260 days also comes from Revelation 12:6, where the woman was nourished for 1260 days. So that's what I'm wondering about that, those time frames. And then we also see, kind of connected to the 1 week, we see the 2 witnesses are dead for 3.5 days. And then also in Daniel 9:27, it talks about the middle of the week. And so we see kind of a repeat of this week time frame. Um, and then, let's see, what do I do in the screen? Oh yeah, so then I brought in Esther. Okay, so at the beginning of Esther, it says, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his princes and attendants, the army officers of Persia and Media, the noble and princes of his provinces being in his presence. And he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days. When these days were completed, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days for all the people who were present at the citadel in Susa, from the greatest to the least, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. Okay, so I stick in those 180 days. Once again, another picture of 666, because 18 is 666, 6 plus 6 plus 6. And then, then the 7 days of the second banquet would fit in to the 1 week. Okay. And then, so we see kind of a repeat of this pattern with the feasts. And so I'm kind of wondering, when you take the Jewish feasts that you have Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, I'm kind of wondering, that happens in the spring. And so I'm wondering if that is the time of the Gentile church. And then what happens is we start counting the Omer for 49 days. Now, I'm wondering if the Omer could be a shadow of Christian martyrdom, or Jewish martyrdom, or both. And that happens for 7 weeks that you count the Omer for 49 days. And then, like I said, that could be, that connects to the 7 years of abundance in Egypt. And then, let's see. So then we move on to, so day 50. So you count the Omer for 49 days, and then the 50th day is Shavuot or Pentecost. And that's when you actually offer up 2 loaves of leavened bread. So what's interesting about this Shavuot is that it's actually day 50, but the Jewish people also consider it like the 8th day of Passover. So definitely kind of interesting. And it's very kind of weird that they offer up 2 loaves of leavened bread, because usually everything's like unleavened. And so that happens in the summertime. And so what I'm wondering is these 2 loaves of leavened bread, like we see a repeat with like the 2 witnesses, and so I wonder if the 2 witnesses, the 2 loaves of leavened bread, are Trump and Netanyahu, or it could be Trump and Obama. So that's what happens on day 50. And then what happens in the fall is that we have Sukkot. And that is a 1 week holiday. And so that could be the time of Messiah. And so what we see in John 7:14 is that we see Jesus in the middle of the feast. In the middle of Sukkot is when he comes and he says stuff. And so we see kind of that repeat of the middle of the week. Okay. And then, so let's see. So then we talk about the Prince of Greece is about to come. Okay, so the other time frame that we see in Revelation 12 is that, okay, so let's read this. And when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the 2 wings of the great eagle were given to the woman so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time, and half a time from the presence of the serpent. And then you could also, if you want more information, look in Daniel 7:25, in Daniel 12:7 for other verses about the time, times, and half a time. And so I'm wondering if the time frame of the Prince of Greece, which I think is the Antichrist, is this kind of weird, obscure time, and half a time. And so that's what I'm thinking is follows kind of this Sukkot thing. Because what I think kind of happens is that Jesus comes and he comes for like 7 days, and then he kind of ducks out, lets the Antichrist do his thing and make a mess of the world. And then we see the holiday that follows next is Hanukkah. And what's interesting about the holiday of Hanukkah, it's about the Maccabees fighting the Greeks to restore the temple. And so then what I think is that we see this picture of with Hanukkah that Jesus returns to deal with the Prince of Greece, which is the Antichrist. Let's see. Okay, and so then what's interesting is we can see a repeat too in Leviticus 12. We see another like bunch of time frames. Okay, and so let's see. So this talks about when a woman gives birth and bears a male, then she shall be unclean for 7 days. As in the days of her menstruation, she shall be unclean. Now, what happens is when a woman has her period, she's separated from her husband. And so that's kind of the picture of being unclean. They're separated from their husband. Okay. On the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Then she shall remain in the blood of her purification for 33 days. She shall not touch any consecrated thing, nor enter the sanctuary until the days of her purification are completed. But if she bears a female, then she shall be unclean for 2 weeks, as in her menstruation, and she shall remain in the blood of her purification for 66 days. When the days of her purification are completed, for a son or a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the doorway of the tent of meeting a 1-year-old lamb for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. Then he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her, and she shall be cleansed from the flow of her blood. This is a law for her when bears a male or a female. But if she cannot afford a lamb, then she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, the one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement for her, and she will be clean. Okay. So definitely like, some kind of weird mystery going on here. And so what I'm wondering is when the woman bears a male, I'm wondering if that's Obama, because it talks about her being unclean for 7 days. So that connects to the 7 years. And then on the 8th day was circumcision. And so I'm wondering if the 8th day was when Trump was voted in. I'm thinking there's like a picture in scripture of the 8th day being like, okay, well, first of all, is when circumcision happens. So somebody gets cut off on that day. So like when Trump was voted in, Obama got cut off. Okay, but then at some point Trump's going to be cut off and the Messiah is going to be, in charge. And then it says, okay, so then it says there's 33 days of purification when the woman remains in the blood. Okay, so that means she's like separated from God. We see this picture of blood, which is like a picture of destruction, a picture of the Antichrist. And so we see 33 days. And so I'm wondering if that connects to the time, and half the times. Because I'm wondering if the, Antichrist gets 33 days. And then it talks about, but if she bears a female, so I'm wondering if that could be Trump. Because Trump could be like, considered like, kind of like the wife of Netanyahu, or like he's like a representative. Like what's interesting is Obama could be a picture, if he's the male, he could be a picture of like like he doesn't follow Christianity, whereas Trump would be kind of more of like the head of Christianity, and so being kind of, where if the woman is the church, then Trump being the head would be a female. And so he's unclean for 2 weeks, or she's unclean for 2 weeks. That would be the 2 years. And then it talks about remaining in the blood for 66 days. So we see that 6-6. And then at the end of this, she's supposed to bring a pigeon for a sin offering. So I'm wondering if the pigeon is a picture of the Kurds. And then she's also supposed to bring a lamb for a burnt offering. So that could either be like the Jews in Israel when they get killed, or that could be a picture of the Messiah who went through suffering. He's a sacrifice for us. And then she's supposed to bring, at the very end, she's supposed to bring 2 doves or pigeons. That could be a picture of Trump and Netanyahu. Okay. And so I just wanted to talk about, just to finish up a little bit, these verses where it talks about the coming of the Son of Man. Okay, it would be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be two men in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. Two women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left. Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time at night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. Okay, and so some of the verses that go with this in Luke, it was the same as happened in the days of Lot. They were eating, they were drinking, they were buying, they were selling, they were planting, they were building. And then it talks about two men being in the field, and then it talks about two women grinding at the mill. So I wanted to bring up this verses in Luke because he brings in that concept of buying and selling. And so there's a connection with the eating and the drinking and the buying and the selling. And I definitely see a picture of the buying and the selling to Trump because he's a businessman, and so everything he's doing is about buying and selling. And what's interesting is that, he was like, okay, let's bring the troops home from Syria, and then, let's get out of war because I want to work on this trade deal with China, so it's all about the buying and selling for Trump. He's not a military man, he's a businessman. And so what I thought was interesting is that, so it talks about two men in the field. Well, Abel gets killed in the field by Cain. So I definitely think there's a prophetic picture there where, Cain could be, Trump, and Abel is a picture of the Jewish people that gets killed. And then it talks about two women grinding at the mill. I see a connection with the millstone is connected to the judgment of Babylon. And so Abel gets killed, and then there's a following of the judgment of Babylon. And then in First Thessalonians, it says, for you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night. While they are saying peace and safety, then destruction will come upon them suddenly, like labor pains upon a woman with child, and they will not escape. Okay, so the thief in the night, I'm wondering if the thief in the night, I'm wondering if it's not that Jesus is the thief in the night, but he's coming like a thief in the night. And so, what I think we might see is that the thief is, the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And so, so what we see is like either Iran or some of of Israel's enemies, they come first, and cause destruction. And then the Messiah follows soon after, okay, or at the same time. So that's what I'm wondering. And then, okay, so then it says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in the midst of the city must leave, and those who are in the country must not enter the city, because these are days of vengeance, so that all things which are written will be fulfilled. But when these things begin to take place, straighten up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which is spoken of through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. So it was interesting because for the longest time I was kind of thinking maybe the abomination of desolation was Trump's peace plan. Because I kind of saw a connection to the Iran deal, which I definitely think is Obama's abomination of desolation. But then recently Trump pulled the troops out of Syria, and oh my gosh, that is just wreaking havoc. And so I definitely think that is probably the abomination of desolation. So I wanted to talk about, because these verses talk about then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. And so we see in Zechariah, it talks about, okay, so this talks about a day is coming for the Lord when the spoil taken from you will be divided among you. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured. the houses plundered, the women ravished, and half of the city exiled. But the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations, as when he fights on a day of battle. In that day, his feet will stand on the Mountain of Olives, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives will be split in its middle from east to west by a very large valley, so that half of the mountains will move toward the north and the other half toward the south. You will flee by the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains will reach to Azel. Yes, and you will flee just as you fled before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. In that day there will be no light. The luminaries will dwindle, for it will be a unique day which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night. But it will come about that at evening time there will be light. And in that day living waters will flow out of Jerusalem, half of them toward the eastern sea and the other half toward the western sea. It will be in summer as well as in winter, and the Lord will be king over all the earth. In that day the Lord will be the only one, and his name the only one. Okay, so what's interesting is the Jewish people read these verses on the first day of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, which we're on day 7 of that right now. And then what I thought was interesting is that, God says, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. So we see I thought it was kind of interesting there, because there's kind of this interesting thing, because in Zechariah it says you will flee by the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains will reach to Zel. So it's kind of an interesting something we want to look at. And so what I put in here is the verses from Revelation, where it says, here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. And then what I thought was interesting was in Esther, it says, the couriers went out impelled by the king's command, while the decree was issued at the citadel in Susa. And while the king and Haman sat down to drink, the city of Susa was in confusion. Okay. So what I wanted to point out was in these verses in Zechariah, is one, okay, so there's going to be a battle in Jerusalem. And then it says, then the Lord will go and fight against those nations. So like the Lord follows the, the war in Jerusalem. And then what's interesting is the Mount of Olives gets split in half. Okay, and so we have a part that goes to the north, and then we have a part that goes to the south. And there's this valley, and actually in the Jewish translation it talks about it being a very great valley. And so what I'm wondering is if the valley is actually where you want to go, because the valley I think represents where Jesus's people are, and then you would have like the north side of the mountain would be like Trump's people, and then the south side of the mountain would be Obama's people. And so we see a repeat with that, with the crossing of the Red Sea, that there's a wall of water on one side and a wall of water on the other side, and they go through on the dry land. And so that's a repeated picture in scripture. And then it's interesting because it says you will flee just as you fled before the earthquake. And so I'm wondering if, like, we see kind of a repeat of this picture in 9/11, where you have the 2 towers and the 2 towers fall. And so what happened when the 2 towers fell? Everybody was running to get away from the falling of these towers. And so I think what God is saying in these scriptures is that, we want to flee into the valley because that is where Jesus is. And we don't want to be a part of either of these 2 towers or these 2 mountains, because they're going to fall. So that's what I'm wondering. And then I brought in these Esther verses because what's interesting is that, let's see, it talks about, it talks about those in Judea. When you see the abomination of desolation, those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Okay, so what I'm kind of wondering is um if we connect those mountains to the 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Okay, so that's the woman of Babylon. Okay, and the harlot of Babylon. So what's interesting is that what I kind of think is going to happen is that the people in Israel are going to need help because this thing that Trump did, pulling the troops out of Syria. I mean, we already sort of knew that war was coming, but it could be coming sooner than later because of what Trump did. Um, and so Israel's going to need help. And so I think what's going to happen is I think Israel is going to ask America for help. But what happens is it says, the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. And so what I see this picture of, if you see the 7 mountains as being, like the 7 churches of Revelation, a picture of America. And what I'm seeing is, and what's interesting too, in Esther, it talks about kind of like the 7 eunuchs. And so kind of like this picture of this power, the powerless eunuchs or the powerless mountains, where this idea of if the woman is sitting, the woman is not going to battle. And so I think that's what's happening is that Israel is going to ask for help, but the woman is sitting on the mountains. She is not going to war. And then we see kind of a repeat of that idea of sitting in Esther, where Haman and the king sit down to drink. So kind of this whole picture of people want to eat and drink rather than go to war, and the Haman is, the bad guy. And so the king and Haman sitting down to drink could be a picture of Trump and, right now he's kind of sitting down with the turkey guy, and whatever, trying to meet his needs or something like that, getting drunk with him, and his power. And then it says when that happened, the city of Susa was in confusion. Okay, is America in confusion now? I think so. So anyways, and then I put in this article about, we're going to finish up with this, because we've kind of like lost track of Iran now that we've been talking about Turkey, but we don't want to forget about Iran because they're still very dangerous there. And so I wanted to talk about Israel risk becoming the fall guy in Donald Trump's shadow war with Iran. So I don't agree with everything this guy says, but he makes some good points. Donald Trump's offer to talk peace with Iran sent a shiver of alarm through Israel's political and security establishment last week. With the too close to call general election looming on September 17th, Benjamin Netanyahu was counting on his hardline anti-Tehran alliance with Washington in fear of conflict to win him crucial votes. A North Korea-style Trump tryst with Iran's president Hassan Rouhani was the prime minister's ultimate horror scenario, one analyst noted. Yet after a recent series of escalatory strikes against Iran-linked forces in Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria, Israel's voters may reflect that if one thing is worse than peace with Iran, it's war with Iran. Trump's policy of maximum pressure on Tehran, strongly backed by Netanyahu and fellow Tel Aviv hawks, is placing Israel squarely in the firing line. The intensifying confrontation is also sucking in regional states, notably Iraq. Netanyahu constantly brags about his close ties to Trump, taking personal credit for U.S. recognition of Israel's illegal annexation, of the Golan Heights and of Jerusalem as its capital. He encouraged Trump's decision to renege on the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran, which is the primary source of today's tensions, and he applauded punitive U.S. sanctions, including an oil embargo that swiftly led to clashes in the Gulf. But slavish allegiance comes at a price. The U.S.-Iran confrontation is increasingly endangering Israel's own security, and evidence that Tehran, wary of direct conflict with U.S. forces, is focusing its military pushback on an attritional campaign by its proxies against the Jewish state. In this respect, Trump and Iran's leaders have something in common. Neither wants an all-out war, but neither will back down. Both prefer that others fight their battles for them. The recent spate of covert strikes on Iran-linked targets, reportedly ordered by Netanyahu with tacit U.S. backing, appeared to have the shared aim of preventing Tehran equipping Hezbollah in Lebanon and allied Shia forces in Iraq and Syria with precision-guided missiles, drones, and other advanced arms. It's uncertain whether the strikes did lasting damage. But they did provoke a defiant response from Iran, which vowed to redouble its efforts, and together they marked a significant escalation. At this critical moment, Trump's word plainly cannot be trusted. His impetuous shift at the G7 summit when he offered a peace summit did not impress Rouhani, who insisted sanctions be lifted first. Who knows what Trump really intends? Probably nobody, including Trump. What is clear, however, is that the regional security situation is worsening, with Netanyahu's Israel in danger of becoming the fall guy in the wider, undeclared American shadow war with Iran, a war Trump is loath to fight himself. Trump's Iran policy, swinging indiscriminately like a wrecking ball through the most brittle regions of the Middle East, is taking a toll on Iraq, too, whose government is being pulled both ways. The U.S. is pressing for an end to Iraqi gas and electricity purchases from Iran and closer ties between Baghdad and Washington's Arab allies. But Tehran continues to exercise considerable influence among the Shiite majority population, not least since the U.S. invasion in 2003. Recent attacks on Iran-linked militias and I need some sleep, and U.S. installations in Iraq were clear warnings of how badly escalation between the U.S. and Iran could destabilize Iraq and the region as a whole. The Independent International Crisis Group said last week Washington's maximum pressure campaign could wind up placing as much stress and inflicting as much harm on its nominal ally Iraq as it does on Iran. Let's see. If ISIS's undercover resurgence is taking place in the shadow of Trump's Iran fixation, so too is the humanitarian emergency in Yemen. Back to the article. Unsuccessful attempts by Adel Abdulmahdi, Iraq's prime minister, to rein in pro-Iran militias belonging to the Popular Mobilization Forces, as demanded by the U.S., have underlined Iraq's fragile state. Leaders of the militias, which led the fight to expel Islamic State ISIS from northern Iraq earlier this summer, refused to accept Baghdad's authority, while their political allies are demanding the withdrawal of 5,000 remaining U.S. troops. Speaking last week, Janine, long name, the UN envoy to Iraq, said U.S.-Iran rivalry threatened to deal a huge blow to efforts to rebuild the country following the defeat of ISIS. The warning came amid reports that ISIS jihadists are making a comeback in northern and western Iraq and Syria, notwithstanding Trump's claim to have eliminated the group, and perhaps in part because the U.S. has, on his orders, reduced its military presence there. If ISIS undercover resurgence is taking place in the shadow of Trump's Iran fixation, so too is the disaster in Yemen, where an inept Saudi-led campaign to defeat Iran-backed Houthi rebels has triggered a humanitarian emergency. The U.S. has backed Riyadh in the teeth of an international outcry. Yet with the Saudis and UAE now at odds, and with the Houthis unbowed, this chaotic offshoot of Trump's proxy war with Iran is further exasperating regional instability. Of all the blunders Trump has made pursuing his Iran obsession, his failure to intervene to help stop Syria's civil war is surely the most puzzling. It has led to a situation where, as of today, civilians in Idlib city are trapped by murderous fire in a dreadful echo of previous sieges. It seems he does not care about that, but U.S. inaction has also enabled the Assad's regime ally, Iran, to reestablish a permanent military presence on Israel's doorstep. If Trump is such a great and trusted friend of Israel, why has he tolerated this threatening development? And why is he essentially leaving Israel to cope with it on its own? These are questions that Israelis should consider when Netanyahu, aka Mr. Maximum Pressure, and cheerleader of the Donald J. Trump fan club, comes asking for their vote. Okay, so that article brought out two things which was really important, was the fact that ISIS is growing in Iraq, and then also the fact that U.S. inaction is causing Iran to establish a permanent military presence on Israel's doorstep. So what's kind of interesting, a good question too I would ask, is how much different is Trump than Obama? Because it seems like, especially when I read about ISIS kind of, growing in Iraq, and then now with the things happening in Syria, all the ISIS fighters that they had in prison, escaping with the mess in the middle, in Syria. I just don't think that Trump has been any better than Obama, because Obama, he did the Iran deal, ISIS grew during his time. And so I think, when, we're coming to the end of this, if we really take a strong hard look at it, we're seeing that Trump's not much better than Obama. So definitely something interesting to look at, something I wanted you to think about and to consider. I just don't think Trump is all that great of a friend of Israel. And then especially after Netanyahu, when he lost the election, well, he hasn't lost it yet, but he hasn't really won it either. Trump hasn't called them yet, and so just kind of interesting behavior. So definitely stuff to think about. And so basically, the real 70th week, obviously, that I think is, is the week that follows the 62nd week, which is the week that follows the 666, and so I think we've seen Trump do his 666. We've seen Netanyahu do his, at least 1-6, maybe more, I'm not sure. And so then I think the next week that we're looking for is the 70th week, which is Jesus's week. And so that's what I think. So thank you for tuning in. And so continue to look up, for your redemption draws nigh. And so definitely look for Jesus, wait for Jesus. Okay. Thanks for tuning in, and God bless.